The president of the HOA thought she was going to teach me a lesson by blocking the entrance to my farm with 3 giant containers. The HOA had already tried everything against me. First, there were the ridiculous fines. Your barn doesn't meet the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood. Your tractor is parked improperly. Your rooster crows too loudly. Then came the veiled threats that my farm was devaluing neighboring properties. But when they realized that none of this was working, they decided to go for something more drastic. It was a Monday morning, the kind of day that starts off wrong. I left the house ready to go about my daily business when I came across the unthinkable. 3 gigantic cargo containers completely blocking the entrance to my farm. 3, not 1, not 2, 3. As if a single container wasn't a big enough obstacle, they decided they needed to reinforce the imbecility with 2 more. Because, of course, why do something slightly stupid when you can commit an epic act of stupidity? I stood there for a good few seconds, trying to absorb the scene. The containers were huge, dirty, the kind that had probably traveled all over the world before being dumped right in front of my property. They bore marks of wear and tear, rust and stickers, indicating that they had carried everything from chemicals to industrial machinery parts. But now they had a new function, a monument to the HOA's complete cluelessness. I climbed onto my tractor and tried to get close enough to get a better look. No chance. They had been positioned millimetrically to ensure that no vehicle larger than a bicycle could get through. That's when I noticed a sheet of paper stuck to the side of the nearest container. I reached down and tugged the paper off, quickly reading what it said. Notification of lockout authorized by HOA. Your property is not in compliance with community regulations. Access will be restored after review and regularization. In other words, they had basically decided that if I wasn't going to follow their rules, then I wasn't going to leave my farm either. They hijacked my entrance. That was it. I looked around, looking for some hidden camera, some evidence that I was being filmed for some stupid reality show. But no, it was real. And you know what was worse? They couldn't legally do that. The HOA had influence over the neighborhood, but no authority over my property. My farm was well outside their regulated perimeter. I only lived nearby, and that was enough for them to consider me a problem. I took a deep breath. As much as I wanted to just take my tractor and push the containers until they fell into the ravine, I needed a better plan. So I called the town hall. I was transferred about 3 times until I got through to someone who understood zoning and private property. I explained the situation, and the woman on the other end of the line was silent for a moment before answering, "They blocked a private access road to your property?" "Exactly." "And who owns the land where the containers are?" "Good question." Because, until that moment, I hadn't realized one small detail. The land where the containers were positioned wasn't mine, but it wasn't the HOA's either, and it was at that moment that my irritation turned into something much better, pure euphoria. Because, if my calculations were correct, the land where the containers were located belonged to a logistics company with whom I had a direct contract. In other words, if the HOA thought they were pulling a masterstroke on me, they were about to discover that they had dug their own grave. All I needed now was a little patience, and maybe a bag of popcorn, because the scene that was about to take place promised to be better than any movie. The problem with certain people is that they think they have more power than they really do. The HOA has always had this divinity complex, as if their every decision was a supreme, incontestable order. But this time, reality was about to fly in their faces. Because, after finding out who really owned the land where the containers were, I did the only thing any sensible person would do. I called the company responsible. I picked up the phone, dialed the number, and was answered by a guy called Mike. I calmly explained the situation, but it didn't take much effort to make him understand the size of the mistake they had made. "Let me see if I've got this right," said Mike, on the other end of the line, trying to hold back his laughter. "Someone put 3 containers on our land without permission?" "That's right. And they blocked the entrance to your farm with them?" "Yes. So the HOA basically invaded our property to punish you? Now you've got the spirit of the thing. The silence on the other side lasted a moment, but was soon replaced by the sound of fingers typing on the keyboard. "Well, this is going to be fun," Mike said, a little too excited for someone who'd just found out he'd been the victim of trespassing. "I'll get right on it." I hung up the phone with a smile on my face, because I knew that, from that moment on, the HOA had no idea how much trouble they were in. While I was waiting for the storm to hit, I decided to take a look at what was going on in the neighborhood. The group of gossipy neighbors had already figured out that something was wrong because they had never seen those containers there before. People whispered. Some stopped to take photos. Others stared at the scene with looks of confusion and discontent. But where was the brilliant mind that orchestrated this idiocy? Gone. Of course she was. This woman loved to stick her hand where it didn't belong, but when it came to taking responsibility, she disappeared. It was always like this. When she was in control of the situation, she was arrogant, authoritarian, and full of herself. But when things went wrong, poof, I went up in smoke. But, as the universe loves irony, at the end of the afternoon I saw her leaving the house. And it wasn't just any exit. It was the way out. Her car pulled up next to my driveway, and the woman got out as if she was about to receive a medal for saving the neighborhood from the big problem that was my farm. She straightened her clothes, took a deep breath, and approached, probably expecting me to start begging them to take the containers away. Unfortunately for her, I was already aware of the impending disaster. I watched, arms crossed, waiting to see what the next pearl would be. She looked at the containers and let out a satisfied sigh, as if admiring her own masterpiece. Then she turned to me and spoke in her usual feigned voice. "I hope you now understand the importance of following the HOA rules." I looked at her for a moment, trying to decide whether it was worth wasting breath on an answer or just letting fate take care of things. I opted for the second option, because, as she spoke, a gigantic truck appeared on the street, followed by 2 cars from the logistics company. And the best part? She didn't even notice. The truck parked, and out stepped a burly man with a reflective vest and a clipboard in his hand. His expression said it all. He was pissed. But the best part? She still didn't know that it had anything to do with her. "Excuse me," said the man with the clipboard, interrupting her little monologue of superiority. "Who was responsible for putting these containers here?" She looked at him like she didn't understand anything. "Who am I?" she asked, as if offended. "I'm the president of the HOA." The man raised an eyebrow. "Great. So can you explain to me why on earth your association blocked the entrance to this land owned by my company?" The change in her expression was instantaneous. It went from a superior look to the classic face of someone who realizes they've got themselves into a mess. "I'm sorry, but I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, yes, you do." Mike appeared at his side, holding a pile of papers and some photos I'd sent him earlier. "We have proof that it was you who put these containers here without permission. And do you know what that means?" She blinked, trying to find a way out. "Well, I can explain." "Explain?" Mike laughed. "You can try. But before you do anything, we've already notified the police for trespassing." The color drained from her face. I almost felt sorry. Almost. Because, after all, this was the obvious consequence of her idiocy. And I knew that this was only the beginning. Now, it was only a matter of time before the situation got even uglier. Because when companies start involving lawyers, no one comes out unscathed. They say that when fate decides to take revenge, it doesn't send a warning. But in the case of HOA, the warning came in the form of a gigantic truck, a furious lawyer, and a woman about to drown in her own arrogance. The scene was almost cinematic. Mike, the logistics company representative, stood there holding a stack of papers, while the burly guy in the reflective vest, who I now knew was Greg, stood with his arms crossed, ready to attack. And the great leader of the HOA? Pale. The woman blinked, trying to absorb the information that, yes, she had just screwed up her own association irreparably. But the problem was that it didn't sink in fast enough. She, of course, tried to get out of it with the same arrogant approach as always. She adjusted her posture, took a deep breath, and looked superior. "I think there's been some misunderstanding." Greg didn't even let her finish. "No, there was no misunderstanding. You put 3 huge containers on our property without permission. That's trespassing." Mike waved the papers in front of her. "And guess what that means?" The silence was almost poetic. The neighbors were already around, watching the shenanigans with the kind of enthusiasm you only see on reality TV shows. Some had their arms crossed, others were muttering amongst themselves, and I swear I saw a lady holding a packet of popcorn. The HOA has always been quick to screw residents with absurd fines and regulations, but now they were the ones backed into a corner. And then came the first bombshell. Mike flipped through the papers and looked directly at it. "This is an official removal order. You have exactly until the end of the day to get these containers out of here, or our company will sue the HOA for trespass and financial damages." The HOA president's eyes widened. "Financial damages?" Greg took a step forward and replied in a sarcastic tone, "Yes, dear. Each one of those containers costs a fortune to transport and store. Not to mention the fact that they're blocking operational access to our company." The woman looked around, trying to find some support among the other HOA members. But surprise! No one wanted to get involved. They were quietly staring at the ground, avoiding eye contact, as if they had suddenly realized that they were on the wrong side of history. And honestly, they were. The HOA had made many blunders over the years, but blocking the entrance to a farm with containers that didn't belong to them was the height of stupidity. And the second bombshell came soon after. Mike pulled out another document and waved it in the air. "Oh, and there's one more thing." The woman was already breaking out in a cold sweat. "What now?" "Our company owns the lot where these containers are. And do you know what that means?" She blinked, unable to answer. Mike smiled. "It means that, technically, you and your HOA have trespassed on private land, and I've already called our legal department. An OR is already being filed." It was at that moment that I saw her soul leave her body. The arrogance that had once been on her face was completely gone. The woman looked around, trying to find some way out, some way to escape this monumental mess. But there wasn't, and the neighbors, who had once been afraid of her, were now enjoying the spectacle. The woman swallowed and tried a different approach. "Well, I think we can resolve this in a more civilized way." Mike arched an eyebrow. "Oh, now you want to be civilized? That's funny, because you didn't seem worried about that when you blocked the entrance to private property." Greg let out a short laugh. "If you don't want a giant lawsuit landing in the HOA's lap, I suggest you start calling in trucks to remove these pieces of junk right now." And that's when the HOA collapsed. The president, realizing she was at a dead end, pulled out her phone and started desperately calling transport companies, trying to find someone who could remove the containers as quickly as possible. But guess what? That cost money, a lot of money. And since the HOA loved to rack up fees and fines to make residents suffer, they were now about to taste their own poison. Because in order to move those giant containers, they would have to pay an absurd price. And worse, as it was an illegal blockade, they couldn't pass the cost on to the residents. It would have to come straight out of the association's pocket. The woman turned red with hatred when she realized this. The HOA, which had spent years taking money from others, was now about to take a huge loss. And karma hadn't finished its job yet, because, while she was trying to come to terms with the transport company, the police arrived. And the look on her face when she saw the vehicles was something I'll never forget. Because now it wasn't just a question of money. Now it was a crime. If there's one thing that unmasks a suburban tyrant, it's when the police show up. No matter how authoritarian someone thinks they are within a neighborhood association, the moment real officers arrive, the attitude changes. And that's exactly what happened. The woman, who minutes before was still trying to negotiate a way out, was now as white as a ghost, her eyes wide, staring at the cars as if they were the chariot of the apocalypse. Two policemen got out of their cars, one of them holding a notepad and the other with that, "I don't have time for your bullshit, so let's sort this out quickly. Look." The lead officer, a burly fellow with shaved hair, looked at the containers blocking my entrance and then turned to the woman. "Can you explain to me why these containers are obstructing the passage of private property?" The HOA president tried to smile, but only managed to make a desperate grimace. "Oh, officer, this is all a misunderstanding. We're just trying to maintain the aesthetics and standards of the community." The policeman didn't even blink. The aesthetics of the community involve blocking access with industrial equipment belonging to another company? The woman swallowed. "Well, not exactly." Mike, the logistics company representative, was already holding back a smile. He held out the documents to the officer. "Here are our company records showing that the containers are on our private property, without our permission. And here is proof that the HOA put them there." The officer took the papers and gave them a quick glance, his face impassive. "Roger that." Then he looked at me. "Are you the owner of the property that was blocked off?" "Yes, sir." "Did you allow these containers to be placed here?" I made a point of emphasizing the answer. "Not in a million years." The policeman sighed, wrote down a few things, and then turned to the HOA president, who now seemed to be holding back tears. "Ma'am, are you aware that illegal obstruction of property can be considered a crime?" The woman turned pale. But I didn't mean to. I just wanted him to follow the HOA rules." The other policeman, who until then had been silent, stepped forward. "Ma'am, the HOA has no jurisdiction over this property. You basically invaded a private space and used property that wasn't yours to block a homeowner's access. That's bad enough. But you also jeopardized a company's operation, and they can sue you for financial damages." The woman was shaking now. And, as if that wasn't enough, one of the HOA members, one of those who always agreed with everything she said, stepped forward and threw her under the bus without hesitation. "Look, I didn't know she was going to do that. I thought everything was authorized." The policeman narrowed his eyes. "Authorized by whom?" The man pointed at the woman. "By her. She decided to do this without telling anyone." The other HOA members started muttering, some shaking their heads, others clearly trying to get away from the mess. It was the end of her reign. No one there wanted to be dragged into the hole with her. The HOA president rolled her eyes at her own board, feeling the stab in the back in real time. "But you were with me on this." The first man raised his hands. "No, we weren't. You signed everything yourself, remember? And that's when things fell apart for good." The policeman sighed, shaking his head as if he'd had enough of all this tomfoolery. "Right. Ma'am, you are officially under arrest for trespassing and obstructing private access." The woman tried to argue, tried to cry, tried to claim that it was a simple administrative error, but it was too late. They put the handcuffs on her right there, in front of all the neighbors. And me? Well, I just watched from the sidelines. The woman was taken to the car, still shouting that she was going to sort it out with her lawyers. But no one else was listening. The neighbors, who had previously been afraid of her, were now whispering among themselves, some recording videos of the scene, others just absorbing the pure and absolute satisfaction of seeing the queen of the HOA finally dethroned. And then came the best moment of all. Mike stepped forward, picked up his cell phone, and made a quick call. "Fine. Send the trucks." Less than 20 minutes later, 3 removal trucks arrived and started taking the containers away. Do you know who paid the bill? The HOA. The cost of the removal, plus the logistics company's fees for illegal obstruction, was so expensive that the HOA had to empty practically its entire financial reserve. And how was the president arrested? The residents decided to oust her the same week. The HOA board, desperate to clean up the mess, dissolved the entire administration, and the neighbors began to discuss the possibility of simply breaking up the HOA once and for all. And what about me? Well, my farm is finally HOA-free. No stupid fines, no ridiculous regulations, no one giving me a hard time because my fence didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. In the end, all I had to do was wait for the HOA to destroy itself. And honestly, It was better than any revenge I could have planned. Did you like this video? Then leave your like and comment below.